Okay, in this video we're going to be looking at the comparison of the approaches. So as we move through each of the different approaches, it's going to be really important for you guys to be really evaluating them in terms of a number of issues and debates in psychology. At the end of the approaches topic, you'll be asked to compare the approaches on each of these issues and debates. And you could potentially get in your exams a 16-mark comparison essay. The structure of this differs from all other essays, so we'll look at this in time, but it's really important that after each approach, not only are we evaluating it in terms of sort of the evidence supporting or perhaps contradicting that approach, but we also need to be really, really confident with where they each stand on each of these issues and debates. So we're going to be looking in this video at what each of these things mean. Bear in mind that next year you do in Upper Sixth cover a topic called issues and debates. And so in this topic, you'll be looking at really the strengths and the limitations of each of these kinds of stances. So you'll have more to add at that point. But for now, it's really important to have just an overview of what we mean by each of these key terms and know how they apply to each of the approaches. Okay, so let's start by looking at this table. This has been distributed to your OneNote. And what I would expect after we finish each approach is that you spend some time completing the table for each of the approaches. You'll notice that the biological approach has been done for you. This is to act as a bit of a model so that you can see the level of detail that you need to go into. I am well aware that online, if you search for comparison of approaches table, that there's lots that are available online. I am telling you that none of them are sufficient for you to get above a C when it comes to this comparison of approaches section. So you must, you can use that as a starting point, but you must really spend some time thinking about each of these approaches and being able to really elaborate. Each of these ultimately is going to make up a Peel paragraph. And so you need to make sure that you've got enough evidence and elaboration and examples in there so that you can just provide a well-reasoned discussion for each approach. Okay, so the first stance or the first sort of issue that we're going to be looking at is the scientific nature of each approach. So really, we're asking you here to draw upon your knowledge of features of science and determine, is this approach in psychology scientific or not? So something to consider is how they actually investigate the mind and behaviour. So as we've looked at, we know that lab experiments are very empirical, they often use objective data and so on. And so if that approach relies on lab experiments, then it's generally scientific. However, as we will see when we get to the cognitive approach, this is not always the case. So really consider the type of research method that they're using. Are they using human participants? Are they using animals? Are they relying on self-report, like interviews and questionnaires? Are they relying on things like dream diaries? So really just consider how are they investigating behaviour in the mind. And then consider whether those methods would be scientific. So draw upon your knowledge of features of science here. Here we're looking for empiricism, objectivity. We're looking for lab experiments where there's been random allocation of participants to conditions and so on, standardised instructions and procedures. We want to make sure that research is replicable, and we want to make sure that they're able to construct testable hypotheses, and this ties into the idea of falsifiability. So really draw upon your features of science knowledge, and for each approach, consider the ways in which they are or are not scientific. It's not as simple as just saying yes they are or no they're not. You really need to be able to explain why. And for many of the approaches, they might have some elements that are deemed scientific while others are not. And so it's important for you to know exactly the ways in which they are and are not scientific. Okay, now we move on to look at the nature versus nurture debate. I'm sure this one is very familiar to you. Here we're really talking about the relative contributions of genetics and genetic inheritance and environmental factors in determining our adult behaviour and personality. So when we talk about nature, here we're talking about really the influence of genes and hereditary factors. And we talk about nurture, we're talking about the contribution of the environment, or this idea of tabula rasa. So for each approach, they're going to be somewhere on the spectrum of nature versus nurture. Some are hardline nature, some are hardline nurture, and some are in between. And so it's important for you to start thinking and almost visualizing where each of the approaches might be on that continuum. All right, we now move on to look at the reductionism versus holism debate. This is a really complex idea, and this is definitely one that we're going to be looking at in more detail next year. But for now, I want you just to understand reductionism as basically explaining behaviour in a simple way in terms of really basic units. So whenever we're talking about a reductionist stance, we're talking about approaches that try and break down behaviour into small constituent parts. So really just trying to understand one small element of behavior at a time. This is really important. I mean, this is exactly what happens with the other sciences, and this is a scientific way to explain behavior. Ideally, we want to be just looking at one variable at a time, but unfortunately, that is reductionist. And so if sometimes it's more objective to study just one simple explanation at a time. We can have greater clarity on the actual contribution of that element. For example, like a specific neurotransmitter on behavior. That can be really, really helpful to understand behavior in very, very simple terms. But it is also ignoring the complexity of behavior. It's really simplistic, and we can sort of lose sight of behavior in context. If we focus too much on the granular details, then we can lose sight of behavior as a whole. And so different levels of explanation are the biological level of explanation. This is where we look at sort of neurotransmitters, hormones, genetics, brain structures and functions, etc. So that's a very, very simple explanation of behavior, a very small element to be investigating. Then as we move up, we start to get a little bit broader. Here we're looking at psychological explanations for behavior. So here we're looking at cognitive explanations and environmental explanations. And then as we move even broader still, moving to more holistic explanations. And then we start looking at social and cultural explanations for behavior. So some of the approaches operate at a lower level and really focus on understanding and explaining fundamental levels of behavior, focusing on like basic component parts or units, and others operate on a more holistic level and try and explain behavior looking at multiple variables at a time, so trying to explain behavior in context. So it's important for you to understand each of the approaches and the level of explanation for behavior. Is it a basic level like biological levels? Is it considering the role of the environment and cognition? And is it looking at society and culture? Okay, and then finally we move on to look at the free will versus determinism debate. So this is a very complex debate. It's got lots of moving parts. When we look at determinism, we're basically saying that behavior is governed by influences under which we have no control. And so there are different levels of determinism and different explanations. Some believe that there are internal influences over our behavior, and other approaches believe that there are external influences over our behavior. But in both cases, if it is a deterministic approach, it says that we have no control, that free will is simply an illusion, and that there are other explanations for our behavior. For example, our genes and hormones dictate who we are, the parenting we receive, the environment, etc. So these are all deterministic stances. And again, each approach is going to differ on whether it is a hardline determinism approach or hardline free will, with many of them somewhere in between. When we look at free will, this is obviously the other end of the spectrum. This says that humans are self-determining, that we are free agents, we play an active role and have choice in how we behave. And although there might be influences on our behavior, we are ultimately free to decide. Our final issue is going to be looking at how the different approaches treat abnormal behavior. So each of the different approaches explain abnormal behavior in different ways. So for instance, the cognitive approach explains things like depression through negative self-schemas and faulty information processing. So the way that they look at then treating abnormal behavior is, of course, by altering these negative self-schemas through CBT. When we look at psychodynamic approach, we're talking about unresolved conflicts and the role of the unconscious mind. And the way that psychoanalysts or psychodynamic psychologists would treat these unresolved conflicts is through this psychoanalysis, trying to access the unconscious mind. Likewise, biopsychologists are interested in neurochemistry and the role of hormones and neurotransmitters, and so they're going to be treating abnormal behavior via drug therapy, drugs like SSRIs and antipsychotics and so on. And so really consider how different approaches explain abnormal behavior and therefore what the treatment for that abnormal behavior would be. So ultimately we're going to be working towards writing a comparison of approaches essay. I've put this slide on here now just so you can see what we're working towards. But we'll look at this structure and we'll look at this in a little bit more detail. For now, though, super important that after each approach, that you're completing the table and really putting some time and thought and extra research into including as much detail as possible, because that's what's going to lead to really successful 16 markers down the line.